Greetings and salutations. This is Derek with Taylor Whips. Today I wanted to talk about some successes and failures that I've had in whips and what I've learned as a result. Here on my work table, I've got 4 different whips that I have made over the years that have either never left my collection or left for a very short time or were gone for quite a while when I got back. Each of these whips has its own story, and I'm going to set those aside for a minute. This first whip that I want to talk about is a 5-foot stock whip that I made, the first stock whip that I ever tried. It's far too stiff, and yet somehow the plaiting is too loose. It's a weird thing where I didn't pull the strands snugly enough, but it's also too stiff at the same time. It was a failing on my part to monitor and work with plaiting tension throughout. The biggest thing that I don't like, the keepers on this whip. They're just simply too tight. A proper stock whip should have some gap between the end of the thong keeper and the end of the handle, and you'll see that this isn't the case. Holding it up, it isn't so bad. Turn this one way, but turning it the other way, it does not rotate all the way over as it should. A good stock whip should function as a universal joint, and this falls short of that. Part of the reason why it does is I have more gap on one side and less gap on the other on the handle keeper. This gives a mismatch and makes it favor the path of least resistance, which is this being open and that being closed. And to turn it over, it requires more tension and it just doesn't work. Moving on to a different whip, we have this whip. This is a 7-foot DeLongis style target whip that I made back in 2019. This was the first custom whip that I ever made. And the fellow who commissioned this was so kind. He's been so kind to me over the years. He told me more or less what he wanted, and I gave it my best shot, and I am decently pleased at how it has held up over the years. Some things about this whip. My friend has actually taken this to Anthony's ranch, and Anthony has gotten to handle this particular whip, which I am very pleased about. He was kind enough to give me some feedback on it. It was sometime after Anthony handled this that I actually got to handle it again and see exactly what he mentioned. Aside from all of that, I noticed that the transition exactly off of the handle has held up very decently over the years, but that there's a section just beyond it that I'm not pleased with. There's a kink here that I don't like, where it goes from decent tension to less tension to way too much tension and on down. And so as this forms a loop, you'll notice that this is not a very consistent loop. And there are several other places like that go down the whip where the tension just is not as consistent as I would hope it would be. As I mentioned, this was a whip very early in my whip making career. There are some places, especially here and there, where my strand drops are far below what I find acceptable today. Those spots I am just not pleased with at all. However, given the knowledge that I had at the time and how well it has held up, I can only beat myself up so much. The hitch that I tied is not the most beautiful thing ever. It's honestly pretty ugly. But it worked, given the only other hitches that I had before this were one where I had no tassels at the end, and the others being 2-strand twists. I can't complain too much that it looks the way that it does. Another thing that I do differently now was this has 2 strands of parachute cord running partway through to about 1 foot through, and then I have cut out the center strand, and so it goes from 2 thicknesses to 1 thickness, and that is too big of a decrease in tension, too big of a decrease in weight, too big of a decrease in everything, in my opinion. And the other thing that allows for is the working end of the fall to be quite fragile. In my use of whips, I would have to remelt and rework that end of the fall far more often than I was comfortable with. Nowadays, I still do taper, but I don't do a single thickness of paracord anymore, for tension reasons, for function reasons, and mostly for durability reasons. I also notice on this whip some gapping that has happened that I didn't know about then, but I can see now. And while this whip isn't a failure by any means, there are some things that it taught me. I'm awfully fond of this whip, and I wouldn't rework it at this point because it has too much sentimental value. But in my next or upcoming projects, I wouldn't dream of having it come out this rough. This whip is the Mark II of that Target whip. The fellow who commissioned this had the idea to have a swell like the Indiana Jones Temple of Doom whip towards the transition. And he wanted a very specific thickness of grip, he wanted a swell of specific measurements, and then he wanted it to be also 7 feet. And I was able to hit this on spec. I tied a very nice knot. By this point, I had started using leather as the heel cap and had a much more refined look. The fall hitch is a lot cleaner looking, a lot more consistent. The tassels are far better. Not perfect still, but far better. This whip has some issues. The first one is there's simply too much weight in the handle. This is a thick and a heavy handle, especially where the swell happens this far out in the handle. I could not put enough lead in the back end to counteract it. That is simply too heavy. And that was the downfall of this whip, was it has too much energy in the handle and it quickly overwhelms the tip as you work it, and you have to be far too precise to get it to follow through exactly as you want it. And beyond that, it's just tiring. It's a beast of a whip. And there was no way that this whip was going to work for what it was intended for. Its predecessor, you can notice, is so much slimmer, both in the heel knot and especially in the handle grip. Coming not very far off, they match up diameter-wise, but there's just so much unnecessary material. I didn't know when I made this whip with the ferrule that having that much weight in that position could be a downfall. It just didn't occur to me. I know better now that having weight concentrated so far away from your hand makes the whip so unwieldy. Now there are ways you can have that same swell, preserve that, the same diameter, and go on down exactly the same. I doubt if I could make that work in any reliable or reasonable way. I would much rather go with a slimmer handle, even if I bulked up the grip. I would much rather have a slimmer handle and a slimmer profile so that the length of the handle and the weight extended far out from your hand, it doesn't overwhelm you. And so this whip has taught me a lot. Originally this had a different fall on it, and I replaced it with this to see if I could make that work without having to gut this entire section of whip, remove the swell to get this to work properly. We ended up making a trade, and I got to keep this one. I wouldn't change a thing about it. It's a piece that I keep to remember. Whip design is very important. And the last one that I want to talk about is this 4-foot Indiana Jones style bull whip. Some things about this whip: I hit spec about everywhere. I did my best to mimic the swell that a David Morgan whip is supposed to have. And according to indiegear.com, I matched the measurements both in the heel knot and in the handle grip and at the transition and the beginning of the thong and on down. The same with the wrist loop. I matched it as closely as I could, and I made the transition on this fairly strong, fairly tight, mimicking a short Terry Jacka. And you can see that this does not flex very much, and so is very strong here and then tapers down. And for a whip of this size to taper so quickly, it resulted to an unwieldy whip. There's too much mass here. It transfers too quickly with this overly strong transition. Just overall, it resulted in a whip that too many things weren't right, and it ended up not working out. I've noticed in reviewing my old work that I will sometimes make the same mistakes. Take this whip, for example. It's got this beautiful brass copper ferrule. It's got a nicely planned heel knot. The colors work. The plaiting is consistent. But I've noticed, mostly using this whip, the Target whip, how there is a bend, a kink, and then a spot of tighter tension. I've noticed that in this whip, it has the same problem. A strong transition, there's a slight kink here that I never had noticed in my work before, and then a spot of over tension. And then it's decently consistent throughout the rest, but I never had noticed that that was a spot where my whips had failed. So reviewing my work, the successes and failings, it has been very encouraging to me to get to review my work so closely. With the encouragement, I have also found areas that I need to improve, that I never would have recognized if I hadn't been looking and examining work that I had not seen for a while. So triumphs, successes, are that these whips still work. I'm so pleased about that. The failings are aesthetic flaws. The failings are poor planning flaws. The failings are not having the whips come out or stay perfect. Some of that you can work through. Like a 6-plat section, a slight twist developing, that's something that I can work on and work through. Or a slight kink after the transition is not something that impedes the function of the whip. It's just annoying to me. But it's something that I can definitely change. Failing in these regards has been far more informative than any success has ever been. Some whips that I've made, I have come into contact with later, and I have been so pleased that they work just fine. Other whips I've come into contact with, and I've known right from the start that something has been off, something has been wrong, and I've wanted to do better. Just because you make a mistake doesn't mean that you can't learn from it. And I have definitely learned from these. What lessons have you learned about whip making that you wish you would have known before? I'd love to hear. Whip making is a journey for everybody. Thank you for coming with me on mine. Appreciate you sticking with me on this, and I'll see you on my next adventure.